Hello everybody, it's Chris Schmidt from Rocket Lasso, and I've got another new tutorial for you today, and we're going to be controlling stuff with Xpresso. Specifically, we're going to be using Xpresso and not the new nodes inside of Cinema. In R23, they added what used to be called Neutron, and it's now nodes inside of Cinema, scene nodes specifically. We're not going to be using those because those are still kind of experimental. They might change in the future. Things we make right now might break, and making controls in that is really complicated. Everything's very open. But Xpresso is still going to be around, and it's tried and true, and I've actually used Xpresso to make a lot of pretty cool and advanced rigs back in my job before even GSG, and I would make tools that made my job go way faster. Now in this, while we will be getting more advanced with the nodes, I'm going to go step by step, almost as if you have no idea what you're doing with Xpresso, but we will introduce a couple of really cool advanced techniques that really open up the design space as far as making interfaces and allowing controls to be more dynamic in when they're applied and only getting applied when you want them to, giving you maximum freedom. So I guarantee you'll get some cool new information from this if you follow along. So let's jump on over to a quick thing I want to mention, which is make sure you are signed up on the Rocket Lasso newsletter. A quick heads up, I've only put out like 2 of these since Rocket Lasso began, so it's not like I go spamming all the time. Pretty much it's just when some big news happens, like a new season of the live stream, or maybe a new plugin has come out. So yeah, it's just a really good idea to be signed up. So I'll have a link below in the description, or you can always just head to rocketlasso.com, scroll all the way to the bottom, and there is a join the Rocket Lasso newsletter. Really simple to set up. Here we are in Cinema 4D R23, although everything we're doing should work in any version of Cinema. Just like the last tutorial, I've set up my scene a bunch just because I want it to look a little bit nicer instead of just a big gray screen. So I've got some chairs from the content browser, a bunch of Redshift materials. I put some lighting in. Now, while I'm using Redshift, that's not a relevant part of this tutorial. You could be using any renderer that you want to, or the vanilla ones inside of Cinema. And I tend to go for Redshift these days just because it's the one that is owned by Maxon. So it's the one I think most people will have access to. So having said all that, none of that is terribly relevant because we are just going to be zooming in here on 0, 0, 0 and beginning by making our object. And as you already know, we're making a Xpresso driven screen. And this is a tool I had used a bunch in my old life. And typically, well, what are we going to put the controls on? Typically, I would put the controls on something like a null. But in this case, I know from experience that it's really nice to be able to just click on something in the viewport and instantly get control over it. And if you're making a big screen, then the main thing you'd want to be selecting is just the screen. So instead of a null, I'll begin with a plane object. That should be facing on Z- for the setup I'm doing here. Z- because that should be kind of a good forward direction. A default here is if I make a figure, you see that's the direction the figure's facing, so it works for me. So the screen is facing on Z-, which means if I apply a material, I've just got a screenshot from my last tutorial. You can see it is projecting correctly. That's all that I want to have happen. Having done that, this is what gets the Xpresso controls. Rename it screen, go down to user data, manage user data. It'll pop open this interface, and the first thing we need to do is click add data. I would like to name this auto height. And the unit will be a real, just so we can have numbers with decimals on it. And before we go any further, it can go as far down as 0, but I think we want to have unlimited in the max value. So I'll say limit max, no. And duplicating that, select it and hold down Control. As I drag just a little bit down, I can make a copy, and this will just be named auto width. Hitting OK, we can now see that those have appeared in the interface under our object, and it says user data, and there the 2 of those are. However, I don't want this to say user data. I want to have some name. Let's get very organized with all of our user data. So in this case, say manage user data, create a brand new group, and if that group gets pulled out of this first one, we can name it whatever we want, in this case, screen. Then move the controls into that. Hit OK, and now you see that it's not a user data anymore. It is just another whatever we want to name it, tab, in this case, screen, and there they are, ready to be controlled. Give that a quick save, and let's add our Xpresso tag. We do that by right-clicking screen, saying Programming Tags, Xpresso. If you're in older versions of Cinema, I think they're just in the top Cinema 4D dropdown. Xpresso will pop open this window. What do we want to be controlling? Well, I would like to be controlling the screen object. Specifically, I would like to be controlling the object's width and height. They say width and height. I kind of like height and width better just because, alphabetical, height and width. What is going to be controlling those? Those are the input. What's going to be controlling them is the screen again. The screen, make it a little bit taller. It's going to be controlling it with our screen tab, auto height, and our auto width. We can make this a little wider if you want to read all the text. These can get directly linked to each other now. So auto height will control the height, and auto width will control the width. This is the output. So we're outputting from red, and it's getting plugged into the input in blue. So output, input. Having done that, we haven't done much fancy stuff yet, but if under screen, we should be able to set our height and width via our screen controls and not the object. You'll see that these icons have changed, indicating that Xpresso is controlling this, and these have also changed. You see the tab, the little triangles on the left side saying that this is being controlled. This is getting input information, and then this one is outputting information. So that can be also useful to keep in mind. Give that another quick save. And back inside of Xpresso, we'll be opening and closing that very often to see our work. This is currently controlling that. But let's say that we want to automatically be able to set this to 16 by 9. We want the screen to be 16 by 9 at certain times. So how about duplicating this node, and we can drag it up and hold down Control or Command. When you let go, it'll make a duplicate of it. So I would actually like to control the controls itself. So that means drag in the screen again. And this time, I would like the auto height to be an input and the auto width to be an input. It's a really cool shortcut that you can drag these directly into the inputs. You just have to make sure it's on the literally same object, otherwise it won't get applied. So we could say, hey, the height also controls the width and the width controls the height. But we need to do a little bit of math to that. Two things we could do. Actually, a little preview happening right there. If I right click, we need a new node. We need the math node. You can right click, say new node, Xpresso, calculate, and there is math. I could click that. Alternatively, you can make sure you're in the X pool, click on the search bar, and just start typing in the word math, and there it is, and that's a lot quicker. That's not to say that it's not useful to right click and just kind of search through these nodes, because it's a good way of learning what nodes are here. Sometimes you might not know which one you need, but we'll probably mostly be searching for them. All right, how do we convert height to the width? Well, typically we're going to be 16 by 9, and typically the screen will be 16 wide and 9 tall as the ratio. Feed the height into the math node and say, I would like to not add, but divide by 9 parts, and then duplicate our math node, holding Control to duplicate it, feed the output into the next one, and then multiply, not divide, but multiply by 16. We've now divided it into 9 parts and then took that one part and multiplied it by 16. That should convert the ratio for us. So if we take that and feed that to now control the width, now this is the height controlling the width, close Xpresso, let's check out what we get now. Well, if I grab the height and start dragging it up, we can control the 16 by 9 ratio just by changing this height, and you can see the width value is automatically changing for us. Very, very good start. The problem here is that if we grab the width and try and change it, as soon as I let go, it's going to snap back to the previous spot. And there's another problem, which is there's even a frame of lag here where you can see if I click and drag, it's like, okay, it stays there, but you see the number drop down? And if I were to do something like go frame forward, it's going to suddenly snap back. That's sort of an order of operations problem that's happening. So let's deal with that first. Let's deal with the order of operations, because this might not be something you know, even if you've been using Xpresso for a while. There is actually an order of operations. Double clicking on the Xpresso tag, it'll pop this open. And if we go to the X Manager, we're going to get a list of every single node in the scene. And this is the order in which they calculate. Now, essentially, we're creating a feedback loop right here where a control is controlling itself. And then it's going to then import that value and do something else. And if this isn't in the proper order, it can internally be calculating a frame of lag for you. It's really easy to fix though. If we select these bottom two nodes, this should be the very last thing to calculate. And you see right now, it is not the last thing to calculate. So if I grab, I have now visually grabbed these two nodes. I know it's these two. I can just drag them down to the bottom, and now those are the last things to calculate. If you want to be really clean, I could select this last one and make sure that, yes, it is the last one. You could grab this first one and make that literally the first object. Most of the time, you don't have to worry about it, but we did create this feedback loop, so that should solve that particular problem. Give this a quick save. Now that we've done that, the only thing we fixed is that frame of lag. So if I drag this up and down, we're not getting that frame of lag. As soon as I let go, it is automatically stuck there. And if I try and change this width, you see it's not updating. It's just stuck there. But that means if I jump a frame, it's not going to suddenly snap. So this is now consistent. Now, what is happening? Well, we are constantly telling the height to always control the width. So it just executes all the time. We need to stop that from always happening. So how can we do that? Well, how about we modify our user data a little bit? Clicking Manage User Data, pop open the manager again. I would like some additional controls. In this case, add a data, and this time I would like it to be a bool. This is going to be a bool, and a bool is just a checkbox. It's an on or off, true or false. This is going to be a checkbox that lives next to auto height, and it will set the width. So let's just call it set.w. And then we'll do the equivalent on the other one, which is set h. So that will set the height. If I hit OK, you'll see that the interface is showing them kind of layered up in one giant column. But what if we wanted to control our interface a little bit more? How about adding a manage user data? Go back over here. How about adding another group? So this group will contain all of our objects. And just by doing that, you see that there's something called group, and it's holding all of our objects. If I hit OK, you see we get this group twirl down, and you can actually collapse controls that way, which can be pretty useful. It's not what we want here. Manage user data and go to the group. And instead of having a title bar, we'll just turn that off, and you'll see that that disappears. And now it looks the same, but these are all grouped together, which means we can give them unique properties. In this case, under the group, say it doesn't have one column. I want it to have two columns. And that means every pair, every set of objects should get lined up with each other. Hitting OK, you can now see that we have height and then the button, and then width and then the button, or the bool. It's an on and off checkbox, so kind of like a button. We'll be treating it like a button. All right, how do we actually apply this now? And this is some of the meat of this tutorial, although we got another fancy thing coming later, so stay tuned. Jumping into the Xpresso tag. I don't want this to happen all the time. I only want it to happen some of the time. When should that be? When should that happen? Well, I would like that to be when the set width is on. So it's currently off. So how can we make the width control when this executes? Well, we can do it with the input on setting. This on is very important, and I use it all the time. By saying on, we've essentially said this is a condition, and only when this is fed something that is true will it execute. And then otherwise, it's being completely ignored. Everything about this node will be ignored unless this is true. So if we say set width is fed into there, then now only, and that's all we need to do for now. Now, if I change our height, you'll see the height is changing on the screen, but the width is not. If I turn the width on, though, if I turn this checkbox on, it is now linking the two of them together, and that will update it. And when I stop, I could say, okay, now turn off the set width, and now they're independent again. So we've set a condition for the execution. Something I think is kind of neat, though, is what if we do treat this as a button? Let's just say that in a given moment, I don't want them to be constantly linked this way. What if I just want to click this checkbox and then it'll be bloop, set and then be done? That means I want this to automatically turn itself back off again. It's a pretty neat thing we can set up by going back into the Xpresso. And this is going to execute when this is true. So when that's true, I would like to do something else. I would like to do something with set W. What is that thing I'd like to do? Well, I'd like to set it as false. So search under the X pool for the word constant, and dragging the constant in, this can output any value. changing the data type to a bool, we can output a true or false constant, and I want it to be false. So this is now saying when set W is true, set W as false. That's it. Closing that. Now you'll see if I click this checkbox, it automatically turns itself off, but it still has that single refresh of executing. So that means I could set this height to be anything that I wanted to, and then say set W, and suddenly the width will match it, and it also turns itself off. So it's like the single click execution. So that's actually working really well. Jumping into our Xpresso, let us duplicate this rig to work with the opposite. Technically, we could just keep everything. We could link more nodes, but I like just duplicating everything. It creates a couple extra nodes, which technically calculate a little bit slower, but not so slow that it is something we should be worried about. So in this case, we just need to swap around a couple of settings. I don't want set W. I would like set H. Also, I want to control set H. So if set W is the on condition, then I want that to turn off. Get rid of that one. And then I don't want the height controlling the width. I want the width controlling the height. Make sure I break this connection. And keep in mind we have to swap out the 16 and 9. So this 9 turns into a 16. And then the 16 turns into a 9. So that just swaps those two. All we've done is swap all that stuff around. We've got extra nodes that we could turn off. I could just double click an empty node and it will actually just disappear from that setup if we want it to be nice and neat and tidy, which isn't a bad idea. Closing that window. Now I can select our screen, and if I change the height, I can say, nope, in this moment, I want to set the width. Let's say the client says it's supposed to be really wide, and you're okay, cool. Now set the height, and that will get set as well automatically. Something that could be nice is making these into real world units. Currently, it's just a reel, but it might be nice to actually have it say centimeters so we can type in very specific measurements. So under Manage User Data, selecting the auto height, this can be set to actually I think it's just a length unit. So I tend not to do that because I like it to be kind of abstracted, but typing in length unit into both the height and the width means I can say, hey, this is supposed to be 10 feet, and it'll do the math for me, and then say set the width, and now it's a 10-foot wide 16:9 screen. Okay, so that covers the basics of this. I'd like to apply the screen material, and let's start getting a little bit fancier. Next up, let's get even fancier, and hopefully you see that wasn't that complicated. We had a couple nodes in here, but nothing too nuts is happening. I would like to add another control. Clicking on screen, user data, manage user data. This control will be add data, move it to the very bottom of this list. In fact, I'm going to move it outside the group and move the group above it. This will be the diagonal, and this should also be a length unit. And I also don't want to limit the max, but this time, actually, we do want to limit the max because I would like there to be a slider this time. And if that slider is there, how about I want this value to be able to go up like pretty much like infinitely high. So we just type in like a crazy big number in that list. We'll never hit that. But then the slider, let's have that max out. Let's have it max out to, I don't know, 10 meters. And now, yeah, which is 1,000. So that'll be 1,000 for the slider. Hitting OK. There's now a diagonal, but we can right click on that and do something cool, which is user interface. And I don't want this to be a float, but a float slider. And that will give us our slider. This diagonal, we're going to be doing similar, but even cooler controls. And that is, if we change the diagonal of the screen, I would like the height and width to automatically update. But I don't want it to constantly override it, only when it changes. And this time, we're not going to do the checkbox technique. We're going to say only if this value updates does the other one update. That is the plan. Let's set up the math for this. Now, this is some relatively straightforward, like Pythagorean theorem stuff. I did have to spend some time looking into it, and somebody in the chat had helped in the practice run. So I'll just run through the math here. Specifically, we want to create, how do we translate a diagonal into a height and a width that is accurate? And just for clarity, if you're buying like a television screen and whatnot, very often a 27-inch screen is the diagonal. So first, we need to create the math. So I want a constant, and that constant will be some ratio. So that will be a ratio of, here this constant will be 9, and then we need our 16. We are sort of externalizing these values by making them separate nodes. Keep in mind, when I search now for the math node, is going to be 9 divided by 16. But we could just type those values directly in by kind of like externalizing them like this with a constant. Anyway, this should be taking 9 and dividing it by 16, which gives us that ratio. Now we need our trigonometric function. So right click, new node, Xpresso, calculate, trigonometric, and this value is going to get fed in and then essentially get the function of the arctan is going to be getting applied. Just trust me on this, or you can look it up. And then we'll make a duplicate of that and split this apart into one there and one here. We want the opposites, so this will be sine and cosine. And that is just translated. These three nodes have now done the magical math we need to convert that ratio. All that needs to be done is to multiply the proper value. The proper value will be from the screen. It'll be outputting the diagonal. And I like seeing the word at this approximate zoom level. Ooh, this is very sensitive, only 1 pixel wide. So we need more math. This is going to take whatever this output is and multiply it by the diagonal. And it's going to do the same thing on this one. Multiply by the diagonal. So those are two different multiplies doing two different outputs, and that should just be, hopefully, doing the math for us that we need. Now, what is this going to be controlling? Well, it's going to be controlling the auto width and the auto height again. So I could just copy this one over because it's got the values that we want. We want the auto width, but we do need the auto height. So here's auto height. And if I were to plug these in, we could say, well, let's turn off the on for a moment and just plug these in. Now, I actually don't know which one of these I need. I always mix up the cosine and the sine. So I'll just plug them in and let's see what happens. So I'll just move this off to the side for a moment, then hit the control and drag. And yeah, I got them backwards. So we'll just swap those around. That goes to here and this goes to there. So height and width, there we go. That should be fixed. And now if I drag it, now you can see the diagonal this is the set value, and as I drag it is now setting the proper 16:9 ratio just by doing this setup. Now, I know this was some specific math. This could just be like whatever, times 2, whatever might be relevant in your circumstance, but 16:9 is a pretty good value for this setup. Having done that, now the 16:9 is working completely fine, and you can see that there's not a frame of lag, so we don't have to fix the order of operations. But of course, this diagonal is always overriding. It's always going to be resetting our height and our width, so those can't update. Even if we hit these checkboxes, nothing's going to happen because diagonal is overriding it. So how do we fix that? Well, double-clicking back into the Xpresso, we need to limit this to what? Well, before we had a checkbox, but I said we weren't doing a checkbox this time. So let's give ourselves a little bit of space in here because here's a technique I just really, really love. I'm going to search for another node, and it's a great node, and that is the memory node. So type in the word memory and pull that out. And this is a node that remembers the previous state of its input. So in this case, we can output the diagonal as the input. This is just something you have to do. Select the memory node and increase history depth to 2, and then increase history level to 1. That way it's remembering 1 level deep of the memory here. So what's the plan? Well, we need to get some sort of condition. How do we compare this? Well, with a compare node, search for the word compare, and there's a compare node. What are we going to be comparing? Well, we're going to be comparing the value of the diagonal to what the diagonal used to be. So what this setup is now doing for us is saying if the value, currently it's set to equal. You see if we select the compare, it's set to double equal sign, which means are they equal? And if it's equal, it's true. But we kind of want the opposite. I'm going to say not equal. So what does this mean? If we're saying the current diagonal and the previous diagonal are different, if they're not equal, that means they're different, which means they changed. So if that value changed, yes, go ahead and update this particular node. So let's say that that goes to the input on, and now I just like it being nice and clean. Now this automatically should intelligently update only when diagonal changes. So now I can change the diagonal, and you see, yes, it is updating the other ones, but as soon as I let go, I can grab the auto height, and that is free to change as well. And grab the auto width, and that one is free to change as well. We've now talked about two different ways of essentially doing the same thing. When should these controls execute? One is kind of intelligent, and it knows when to do it automatically, and the other will only do it when we very specifically tell it to. But these controls are now doing overriding, and that is kind of the power of this type of slightly more advanced Xpresso. I'll give that a quick save. And just for fun, we can add a couple extra controls on here, but the meat of the fancy Xpresso is sort of done. But let's add some extra controls onto this screen and just make it ready to be a kind of a usable tool for us. How about we add a control for controlling where this pivots from? Because you can even see as I've been playing with this, it's really easy to increase this to such a size that's intersecting with the floor. So it's always like, okay, well, it's big, so that means I have to move it up. And you could be having updates. So how about making a pivot of some sort? So we need a pivot control. Add user data, drag it down. It's already defaulting to %, which is what we want in this case. And how about, do we want to go from 0 to 100? Yeah, I think so. So we'll name this pivot point, and it's at the bottom of the line. Hit OK, and now you see we have a pivot point. Right click, user interface, and set it to a float slider so we get that nice slider up and down. My thought is when this is at 0, it'll be pivoting from the ground, and when it's at 100, it'll be pivoting from the top, and 50% will be the midpoint. Just for a little bit of organization in the user data though, how about going back into it and creating another user data and setting this to the data type of a separator. I really love these separators. Moving it down after the diagonal, but before the pivot, I would like this to just be a separator line. And that's just going to distinguish that this is sort of a separate control. Hitting OK, you just see there's a little line cutting in between there. And it's just indicating that, oh, these all have a relationship with each other, but this one, not as much. This is sort of a different concept we're looking at now. Quick save there and jump into Xpresso. How do we want to control this? Well, it's actually going to be a little fancier than I was originally intending, because typically we would just put this into a null and then the screen would move up and down and the null wouldn't move. But we put all of our controls on the screen directly. So I want everything to be a child of this. So what I'll do is modify this with a deformer. Now in this case, that'll be with a plane effector. Drop that as a child of the screen and then say I would like this to deform the points, and you see everything just moved up a little bit. So by default, this Y is indeed what I want. I want this to push points up and down. So this parameter right here is what we want to control. So double click your Xpresso, open it up, and actually this all goes down here. This is the final output. So this is where things will get controlled for us. I would like the plane to get controlled. What specifically? Well, I would like the Y, and you see I'm very carefully grabbing just the Y, and it'll just drag that single number. Otherwise, if you grab the P by accident, it'll actually drag over a vector of X, Y, and Z. We don't want that. So we now need to figure out the math to set that up. We now have an additional variable to play with, which is pivot point. That can be dragged in. And now we can do math based on these. Obviously, everything's going to be affected by the auto height. That's the main thing. So we need to multiply the auto height by the pivot point. We already have a nice multiply here, so I'll just hold Control to duplicate it. Take the auto height and then the pivot point, and those will multiply each other. And feeding this in, let's see what we need to change to make it work. Feeding that in on a multiply. Let's see what we've got. Well, it is currently pivoting at 50%, and you can see it's pivoting directly where our axis is. So if I were to drag this further down at, well, let's make this a reasonable height. So how about just dragging that down a bit? So as I drag this up all the way, you see it's kind of offset by what looks like half of a height. So we need to add half the height. And I am just making this up as I go because I didn't practice this part. So by adding another multiply, I would like to take the height, multiply it by 0.5, so we get half the height, and those need to get added together, I believe. So one more duplicate of the math node. Adding these two together. As possible, I need to subtract instead, but let's just find out. Add those two together, and what do we get? Yep, might have overdone it. So 0 is pivoting from there, and that goes up. So yeah, we need to subtract. Pretty straightforward. Change this node to subtract and rearrange these so we get that first value, and then that gets subtracted afterward. And let's see what we got just by rearranging those nodes. And honestly, often when I'm building these rigs, I just am like, oh, I kind of know how this will work, but I don't know if I'm supposed to go up or down, and I'll just try one. Nope, didn't work. Switch it to the opposite one. So let's see. Our goal is when this is at 0, we're on the top, and then when we go to the opposite, it's on the bottom. You'll see that it's doing the opposite of what we're intending. So mathematically, we could fix that by swapping some things around, but honestly, it's giving us almost exactly the proper value that we want. So why don't we just invert that value using the good old range mapper? If you ever do any Xpresso, you probably have used a range mapper before. Drag the range mapper in, output our subtract into the range mapper, and then output that into the Y. And this is pretty straightforward in that I'm just going to say, hey, a brief explanation of the range mapper is it's going to take the input lower going up to the input upper and then map that to the output lower and the output upper. So to invert these, all we need to do is say, actually, it's going from 0 to 1 to 1 to 0. So as those get mapped, it should just invert those numbers for us. And that should hopefully mean that now I'm pivoting from the top, the middle, the bottom. So if I say pivot from here, now if we update our diagonal, it's just going to keep on pivoting from that exact location. And like I said, the best part is if you're working on your scene, you're moving things around, you're like, oh, click on the screen. Instantly, we've got the object that is generating the controls. That's the goal that we had done originally with that. So that can pivot where we want. It could be sitting directly on the ground. So type in 0, it sits on the ground, and we can increase the diagonal. We could increase the height, auto set the width based on it. We could set the width automatically and say set the height. Always going to pivot from the ground because we went and set up the math, and think of how much time this could save us in the future if we're using this object again and again and again. So make that a little bit larger, and having done that, hit save. Let's add a frame onto this. I'm not going to add any controls. We can start manually adding controls and more and more and more, but we're not going to do that in this case, but you totally should. In fact, that should be a challenge for you to see if you can add on those additional controls for this frame. But in this case, I would like to just make a rectangle spline so you'll be able to sweep something. Now, if I make this a child of the screen, you see it's going to get deformed, but it's going to look a little bit funky. And that's because of the way the spline is being interpreted by this plane deformer. That can be fixed just by grabbing the plane deformer and saying the transform space is not based on the node. In this case, it's looking at each individual point, which is confusing it. And just say, hey, it's based on the effector, which means everything gets pushed up. And now you can see that it is also deformed upward to lay in the correct spot. All right, double clicking. We need the rectangle to be getting the same height and width. Pretty straightforward there. Just dragging the rectangle in. What are we controlling? We are controlling the width and the height. So width to width, height to height. Rearrange them so they're in order. And we're getting a little crowded here, so these can get scooted down just a bit. And that rectangle, with any luck, is perfectly outlining this entire object. This goes into a sweep. So hold down Alt as I create the sweep. It'll become a parent of it. Create a rectangle. That'll become a child. I held down Shift, so it became a child of it. T for scale. You can see I can scale that down. I'm just going to add this black shiny material so that it doesn't get the screen applied. One thing that's going to be happening is this outline is going to be pivoting halfway in and halfway out. We can get around that pretty easily. Let's set this to a very precise number. I'll say 20 by 20. Actually, I'd like it to be half as deep. So I'll go only 10 on the height. So if we take this rectangle and feed it into a connect object, I love doing this, put into a connect, hold down Alt, it'll automatically become a parent of it. Now this rectangle, we can move the object of it, and its pivot point isn't changing because the pivot is wherever the connect object is. So by scooting this out 10 units, that should now pivot perfectly on the outline of the edge. This is, like I said, the challenge for you now would be, if you wanted, make some extra controls so that you can control how thick that is, maybe how deep it goes, and it could also be pivoting off the ground properly from that. If you don't want to get that fancy, I could just say, okay, just pivot. Actually, if we, here's something that's cool. With the way we set this math up, I'm pretty sure we should be able to go into our pivot point. Let's say manage user data. And currently I can't go below 0. But if we go into our pivot point and say, hey, get rid of the min and max, or let's just increase this so it can go like 1,000 and it can go negative 1,000. And then say, hey, the slider is saying, hey, only go from 0 to 100, which is the valuable numbers. So say, okay, it doesn't look any different, but now I can drag this to negative numbers. So by going a little negative, it's now going to pivot like 5% off the ground all the time. So just a little bonus to be able to unclamp your sliders, which depending on what you're working on, unclamping them can be really, really powerful. That gives us this frame. It's all just working quite nicely. The last thing I would like to do is just be able to add some curvature to this screen. That's another use case for Xpresso. Creating a bend deformer. And actually in R23, you have to make sure to make this a child. And I'm going to make it the first child. And you'll see that there's an alignment. And I want this to be aligned on X plus. But if you're in older versions of Cinema, you'd actually physically rotate it. So it's just an important detail. So clicking Fit to Parent, that'll jump and automatically map onto this object. I actually don't need any of this height. That can be dragged down to 0. You see, even as I drag this down, it doesn't... Well, let's start deforming it a bit. Here's... I don't want to lose you, so let's go slow. This is now mapped properly. Let's give ourselves a couple of subdivisions. So clicking on the screen, I want some subdivisions across. So go to Object, we have our width, and we do have 10 segments and 10 height segments. We don't need any height. We won't be deforming on that angle. So let's say 20 subdivisions going from left to right. Hitting NB on the keyboard, you can see those subdivisions show up. All right, having done that, we also need some subdivisions to happen in this rectangle. Actually, let's go to the screen and set that to 16 across. And now I would like the rectangle to be subdivided by setting that to a natural subdivision. We can type in the same number 16, but it's not going to perfectly line up because the number actually needs to be 1 lower than you'd think. But now there are 16 subdivisions on that spline, meaning clicking on the bend and saying, hey, let's start bending this. If we bend it the correct orientation, which will be negative 90, given what I set up, you now see it's bending forward, and the screen and the border are both bending as well. But you'll see that's pivoting from the left side, and you've probably run into this before where you want something to bend a little bit equal on the left and the right. So let me show you how I would go about doing that. First of all, we want this to be half the width. So we've got the height, well, it's rotated 90 degrees, so here is the width. So just say divided by 2. So that's divided by 2, and I'm just going to eyeball this. Let's scoot this off to the right. And you can see that just that right half is bending. If we click in the bend and say mode unlimited, it's actually going to do the opposite on the other side. So as long as our bend is pivoting from that center point, it's going to properly bend both sides. Having done that, I want to throw out that this size vertically and this being offset doesn't matter. If I move this up and down, nothing changes. If I change this size X to 0, nothing changes. All we care about is this height. But now we need to control exactly where this is placed based on the numbers we get from our Xpresso setup. The first thing we need is this strength slider. That's something we want to control. Here's another cool Xpresso thing, user data thing. Right-clicking it, say user interface, copy user data interface. And then going to our screen, I can say, hey, paste the user data interface. It'll pop open, and now there is the strength slider with all those same settings, and we can just drag this around and make it do whatever we want. So I don't think we want to go too far. So we've got our max and min. I'll set that to, let's say, negative 90, positive 90. And just for clarity, I'll say bend. So that controls the bend. It doesn't need to be named strength. The nice thing, though, is it brought in automatically that is a degree. These are degrees we can control. So at the center point is where there'll be 0, but I don't mind it being a little bent out of the gate. Now, how do we control the proportions of this properly? Pretty straightforward, especially compared to some of what we've already done. Double-clicking on the Xpresso tag. We would like to control... I'll just drag a new one in. I'll drag in the screen. And... no, we don't need a new one. I want to control, use the bend, And what am I going to control from the bend? I'm going to control this bend. What information are we going to be affecting? Well, we're going to be controlling the strength of it. We know that. Now keep in mind, we're doing double amounts because it's going to bend fully on one side and then fully on the other. So if that was like a 10-degree bend, we'd have to cut it in half. So let's steal a multiply node, take the bend and multiply it by 0.5. And that is actually the final output into the bend's strength. So that's all good. And then we have two things we need to control. We need the X, Y. So it's the Y value we need. So you'll see that I can't, there's no way of separating these out. Well, there is a way, but you have to do a couple clicks for it. So instead, let's just do the input. I want the input object property size Y. That's what we want to control. We already know it's half the amount, so let's copy another multiply. Actually, this one, well, here's always a tricky thing I struggle with. This is taking the height. Actually, it's a width we want, so it's not actually a problem. But yeah, I just ignore what I just said. I'll copy this node over. I want to take half of the width. So it's 0.5 of the width. That should now be the Y size. And we want that to move over a certain amount. But I eyeballed it when I moved it over. You'll see that currently half the size is 400 something. It's a 400 something. But when I moved it over, you see it's actually 220, which is half the amount. That means we need a quarter of the width. So we can take another multiply. We can either say, multiply a 0.5 and then another 0.5, or you just take another one and say, I would like to multiply and get 0.25% of the width. Feed that in. And actually, what value is that? I think it's just our X, but let's double check. Actually, no, it did automatically rotate this. So let's just be sure of what value you want. And that is going to be X. Yeah, it is X. So here's the X value. I could just drag it right on over into the bend. And that controls the position. It's possible it's the opposite direction. No, it seems correct. So now you'll see if I try and move this left and right, it's not going to let me. And I can't change the height anymore. That is... Well, as soon as I let go, you see that's getting overridden, and the strength is getting overridden. All those are now controlled by our object. Visually, I don't want to see this bend, so I'll just double click to hide that. Click on our screen, and now we've got a bend control. Change the bend amount, and that should be giving us a 90-degree turn. If we look from the top, there's our screen, and it looks weird from there, but if we rotate that 45 degrees, you can see indeed that looks like a 90-degree turn. Working very, very nicely. That is all the controls that I wanted to add in on here. Manually, you could add so many things. You could add how thick the screen gets. You could add in some depth on it. Actually, I would like to block the back of the screen. Let me show you why. If we open up our Redshift renderer and hit play, then now you see that we're getting a render. I'm going to turn our lights down. So I'll grab our ceiling lights and lower the exposure way down, and you see my screen is projecting out light, but the screen is on the front and the back. So if I want to block the back out there, I'll have to do a couple things. So my thought is, what if we just make another copy of the screen? I could make a copy. It is, keep in mind, if I make a copy, everything comes with it. So we could manually make another one. Let's add another and set it to a couple quick settings just to be thorough. It should have 1 segment height, 16 width, and actually all that's good. I just need to move it back a little bit, manually move it back, and now it just needs to be fed the same values. So we'll just call this back, double click on the Xpresso, and where is our original screen? So here's the screen. That's pretty much what I want, so I'll just make a duplicate of that. Copy that. And it's literally the same type of object. So here's another Xpresso trick. Here's the screen with the height and width. I'm just saying, hey, it's actually now the back with the height and width. As long as it's literally the same type of object, you can swap it out like that. So that now gets the height. It now gets the width, and as simple as that to plug that in. And that should now scale up to the proper size to take those on. I would like some sort of dull material. I'll just take this fabric material, put it on there. So now there's a fabric backing to that, and it gets deformed by everything else. So I can just scoot that to whatever depth I want. And just by doing that, I should be able to turn my renderer back on again. And dim the lights. And you can see that it's now blocking the light from shooting out the back. We covered a bunch of different details here. There's a lot you can do with Xpresso. The point is, it's really hard to make Xpresso tutorials. So I was kind of excited to make one here, even if it's not the craziest thing, because literally every rig that you want to make is going to be unique to you. There are going to be very specific settings of what you want to do in a very specific way with specific controls. And so there can never be a tutorial on here's Xpresso on how to make a door. Here's Xpresso on making stairs. Here's Xpresso on making anything. What you need to do is know the basic tools. And this is going to be true when the scene nodes, when future scene nodes come out. You just have to learn what some of the different tools do. And then you can make anything that you want to make. And my goal here was to give you the tools of making things only execute when you want them to, only when a parameter updates, or only when you change the width or change the height. I think there's a really nice circumstance to show you some of the power of Rocket Lasso's very first plugin, and that is Recall. To show you Recall, how often has this happened? I'm going to hit NA so we can see the chairs. How often has this happened? You are there and you're setting up your camera angle. Let's go and make our camera, link to it, and get that perfect position. And we're like, okay, where should it be? Just a little offset. You don't want it dead center. So there, that works. And then you're working on the scene and you're arranging the chairs. And then the client wants the screen a little bit bigger. So we click on the screen and then start dragging that up to be even bigger. And you're like, okay, is that working? Make sure it's on the ground properly. And at a certain point, you're like, oh, dang it. Like, I moved my camera. Like, what was the camera angle? So you say view, undo view, or the shortcut, Control-Shift-Z. And you're like, undo, undo, no, 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 maybe? Or is it that? Or was it that? Or was it that? And you're trying to figure out which position it is. That would happen to me all the time. But now I can right click on that camera and add the recall tag from Rocket Lasso. By creating that, there's an empty recall tag. Double clicking it, it will store the current state of the object in the tag. All the information about the camera is stored. So that means I can go and rotate around, do any changes I want, click on the screen, say, okay, it's a smaller screen, and then be like, oh, I need to go back to that camera position I had. Just double click on the recall tag and it'll jump us back to that exact position with all the same information. Let's go and add another one. Let's move to a different position here and change the zoom level and hang out on the left side here. Right click, add another recall tag, double click to store the current state, and now I can jump back and forth between those two. But we can do even more, and that is, how about selecting let's just duplicate that tag again, find another position. Let's look out over the audience. And by copying the tag over, I can say, hey, let's override that tag. So that's overridden that one. So now double clicking, I can jump between any of those tags. And then finally, let's go and find one last camera angle for ourselves. We'll zoom in on the audience here. And yeah, it'll just be a crowd shot of everybody who's hanging out in the venue. So we'll duplicate the tag, and instead of clicking override, I can hold the control button and double click on the tag. So you see it's just a double click workflow. By double clicking, I've overridden that tag. It gets a new color to show you that yes, it has overridden. And now I can just double click on any of those tags and we'll jump immediately to that position. But you can even get crazier. I'm not going to do it here, but you can, one of those could be keyframed camera. One could be linked to a spline and have tags. All that information will come back. And it's just really nice to be able to maneuver around like that and get every shot that you need. Another quick use case for this is I've got a couple different types of chairs here. Let's unlink. Actually, we don't have to unlink. We have a recall tag on it. So I'm going to zoom in over here and let's pull out this chair. And I've got 3 different types of chairs. Let's say that you're working at a place and they have 3 different types of chairs that they use all the time. So here is the first chair. And here's the second, and then here's the third. So we got 3 different types of chairs the company uses all the time, and they have to get swapped out all the time. And the boss comes in and says, no, use the yellow chairs instead. So you can go open up a different file, copy it over, have it be moving it from one side to the other. But what you can do is just select all 3 chairs, right click, add a recall tag and say store. And now it has stored the information of each individual chair and its entire model inside of it. So let's be a little bit organized. Selecting this first chair, it's kind of the gray one. So selecting the recall tag, I say, hey, you are the gray chair. Take on a gray color. The second one's kind of white. We'll leave that way. Grab the third one. That's the yellow chair. Select a little bit yellow. So now we've got these 3 tags representing the 3 chairs. Drag all 3 onto just one of the chairs, and I can just delete the other 2 chairs. So let's put this chair into the cloner. And, uh-oh, I lost my camera angle. No, I didn't. Double click on the tag, and now we jump back to that position. And you can see that this is now the chair that's being created. It's in the cloner. But I could be like, uh-oh, the client wants the white chair. So you double click on the white recall tag, and it brings that chair in. Double click on the yellow one, and the yellow chair comes in. Very, very quick to be able to swap all the stuff around. I really wish I had this back when I was doing these types of renders all the time. jumping around to our different camera angles, jumping around to our different chairs. It's just a really useful tool. I think it's really cool, and it really can speed up your workflow. Thanks for checking out that little demo of Recall. I'm really glad that we got to make this overall tutorial. I've been wanting to get all this Xpresso information into one place. I think I've had those little tidbits here or there, but it's really, really fun to make your own tools, to make a rig that's going to be useful in your job, some sort of repetitive task or something that's going to be changing pretty often. It's always worth that effort to do that little bit of R&D and build out your rig ahead of time, because it'll save you so much time later on down the road when you can just change the settings really, really quickly. I was always very excited every time I thought of a new feature I could sneak into one of the tools I had been building myself. So that's going to wrap this up. Don't forget to join the newsletter. Thanks for checking out Recall and for watching this tutorial. I'll see you in the next live stream or the next tutorial. Bye-bye, everybody.